Is there really a God who created and is over all this world? This is the most basic yet most essential question to understanding anything about life on this earth. If there is no God, then the meaning and purpose of life is significantly different than if there is a God who created and is over it all. But is there even a way for us to arrive at a definite answer to this question? Certainly there are multiple ways that mankind looks at the origins of this universe, this earth, and life on this earth. For some, the answer is that there is an eternal God who is so powerful and wise that he was able to create everything that we can see and everything that exists in this physical realm. Most people who believe in the reality of God will believe in the Bible's account of creation that is recorded in the book of Genesis in chapters 1 and 2. In it, the Bible says that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days and then rested on the seventh day. On the first day of creation, God made light. On the second day of creation, God made the firmament or sky. On the third day of creation, God made the dry land, gathered the waters together into seas, made the grass, herbs, and trees. On the fourth day of creation, God made the sun, moon, and stars. On the fifth day of creation, God made sea animals and birds. And on the sixth day of creation, God made land animals and mankind. And then God saw that all that he had made was very good, and rested on the seventh day. But for others, they have not accepted the reality of God and look for a scientific, so-called explanation as to the creation of this universe, earth, and life on earth. The current most widely accepted alternate explanation is commonly referred to as the Big Bang Theory. Although it admits to not being able to explain the origin, it does attempt to explain how the universe and the world as we know it today has resulted from a tiny particle much smaller than a pinhead or the period at the end of a sentence. A typical explanation of this will say that around 14 billion years ago, there was a Big Bang or explosion of this particle. From that explosion, the universe began rapidly expanding. Eventually, galaxies and planets are said to have formed through the right combination of gases and particles. And then, once this Earth had formed, it is said to not have resembled the Earth today. Instead, as the theory of evolution explains, millions of years ago, an accident occurred in which the chemicals that were collected in the oceans or lakes formed an organic soup, and the right molecules combined to bring about life. And then, once the first living thing had formed, it continued to evolve or change into various life forms over millions of years. Once life had formed in the sea, it crawled onto the land and continued to evolve, adapting to its surroundings. Gradually, one thing changed into another, until apes finally evolved into human beings. Certainly, these are two very different ideas about the origins of this earth and life on it. And there are many people who are left questioning the reality of God after they are presented with so-called evidence for the Big Bang Theory and the theory of evolution by very intelligent people who have studied science in great depth. Then they're left looking for the evidence of an intelligent designer or creator. First, it is important to demonstrate that faith is required to accept any explanation of the origins of life and the universe. You were not there, and neither was anybody else who is living today. There are no video recordings of what happened, so you must simply examine the evidence that exists in order to form a conclusion that agrees with sound reasoning. Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 3 says, "By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible." Yes, it does require faith to believe in God, but I contend that it takes a greater and less reasonable faith to trust in the so-called scientific theories of origins many have used to explain the universe and life today. For God says that all the evidence you need to know that He exists can be found in the world and the universe that is around you. Psalm 19 and in verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows His handiwork." Romans chapter 1 in verses 19 and 20 say that what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. There is so much evidence for God in this world that the only reasonable conclusion is that He really does exist. Throughout this lesson, we want to briefly examine this evidence so that we can believe that God really exists and understand what we should do with this knowledge. We'll examine the evidence for God in science, in nature, and in the Bible. First, let's consider the evidence for God in science. The word science refers to knowing about the natural world around us. There are two major types of science. The first is observational science. This kind of science seeks to observe, test, and examine things with our senses. The second type is historical science. This kind of science often makes educated guesses or assumptions, hypotheses, theories about how something came to be whenever it cannot be directly observed. But when seeking an explanation about origins, the common explanations, like the Big Bang Theory, offered by those engaged in historical science, contradicts what we can currently observe to be true. Instead, there is actually evidence for God in the science that we can observe. I want you to consider a few examples of this with me. First, consider the first law of thermodynamics. It is widely accepted by atheists and by those who believe in God that this universe is not eternal. It must have begun at some point in the past. Given this fact, the first law of thermodynamics states that within an isolated system, one that does not interact with its surroundings, matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. The only thing that it can do is change forms. So the total amount of matter and energy in this system, in the universe, stays the same. Now, before I illustrate and apply this to our subject, I ask that you please recognize the difference between a scientific law and a scientific theory. A scientific law refers to something that is provable and is absolutely true. For instance, the law of gravity is something that can be proven by science, by scientific testing and observation. However, a scientific theory is an attempt to explain something that is known, but it remains a theory until it can be proven absolutely true. And therefore, as we go through this section of our study, please observe the distinction between the theories to explain the origins of this universe, the world, and life, and the laws that are provably true through observation, like the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is illustrated through a gasoline engine. There's only a certain amount of energy that is contained in that system. This energy is put through a combustion process in order to accomplish work, resulting in the movement of an automobile. But there's only a certain amount of energy in this system. There is no more energy that can be spontaneously created. It can only change forms. So, as an application of this observable law of science, it is reasonable to ask, where did all of the energy in this universe come from, since matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed? Scientists cannot explain the answer. It's a great mystery to them. Even if they begin their theory with a small particle of matter and energy that is smaller than a pinhead and the period at the end of a sentence, this does not explain the origin. At some point, scientists and atheists must explain how something has resulted from nothing, let alone how something so grand as this universe began from nothing. and then even according to the Big Bang Theory, how could all of the matter and energy in this universe have possibly been contained within such a small particle? It simply could not be. And thus the only possible and reasonable explanation for the creation of all the matter and energy in this world is for there to be an eternal and all-powerful God who was behind it all. Now, consider the second law of thermodynamics. So building on the first law, the second law of thermodynamics states that there is a natural tendency for an isolated system to move toward increasing disorder rather than order. This is something that is testable, observable, and repeatable. And this law of science contradicts the theories that are promoted, like the Big Bang Theory. For instance, the second law of thermodynamics can be observed whenever people burn wood for heat. According to the first law of thermodynamics, there is only a certain amount of energy in that wood. Whenever it is burnt, most of the energy is transformed into heat. However, there is a part of the energy that remains and becomes unusable, the part that turns into ash. So the ash is an illustration of a system moving toward disorder rather than order. This is why so many people are focused on conservation. For if things naturally move toward order rather than disorder, there would be no need to conserve our natural resources. They would always be abundant. The application of this law to our study is that chaos does not result in order. I want you to observe the order in the world that is around you. Now, it's commonly said that this order traces back to an explosion of a single particle. So according to this theory, for billions of years, there would have been a progression toward order rather than disorder. Yet we can observe a natural tendency for things to move toward disorder. Why did this change? And just from our own understanding, consider what happens whenever there is an explosion. Is the result order or disorder? How could we possibly conclude that order resulted from chaos? The answer is that we cannot reasonably conclude this to be true. Instead, we must conclude that an intelligent and all-powerful God purposefully created all the order that you can observe around you today. Next, as we continue to consider the evidence for God in science, I want you to consider the law of cause and effect. As you study everything in the universe around you, everything that happens, every effect, must have a cause. But not just any cause is sufficient. Instead, the law of cause and effect states that every material effect must have a cause that came before it or simultaneous to it and is greater than it. For instance, one effect that can be observed is that an American flag has been raised on the surface of the moon. Surely no one believes that flag was eternal or evolved gradually over time on the surface of the moon from the various components that make up a flag. We understand that this effect must have had a cause. It could not have just happened. But surely no one thinks that just one man decided to plant a flag on the moon by himself without the aid of any mechanical equipment. Why? Because no man is capable of causing such an effect by himself. So there must have been a cause greater than the effect. In this illustration, the cause was a manned spacecraft called Apollo 11 on July 16th, 1969. So the greater cause of three astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, utilizing great technology and a space shuttle, placed the American flag on the surface of the moon. The application of this law to our study is that the effect of this magnificent universe and world around us must have had a cause that was greater than it. So what is the cause that is greater than the effect that you can observe today? As we have already seen, it is impossible for something to come from nothing. So nothing cannot be the material cause that is greater than everything you see around you in this universe. Yet scientists who adopt the Big Bang Theory must eventually conclude that something has come from nothing. Instead of reaching such a preposterous conclusion, it is much more reasonable to conclude that God, who is not material in nature but spirit, John 4 verse 24, is the cause behind the effect that can be observed today. Another example of a scientific law that is observable and disproves the theories many have offered for the origin of life is known as the law of biogenesis. This law states that life can only come from other life. That is, every living thing has parents. At one point, it was commonly thought that life came from something that was not living. For instance, people observed that whenever a piece of meat rotted, maggots would surround it, and then those maggots turned into flies. In 1688, a man by the name of Francesco Redi disproved this thinking whenever he demonstrated that only meat that was left exposed so that flies could get to it and lay eggs on it would produce maggots. And then in 1864, a man named Louis Pasteur further disproved the idea of spontaneous generation, or the idea of life coming from non-life, in his experiment. In it, he proved that nothing living would ever spontaneously generate from something that was non-living. The application of this law is significant. Outside of the miraculous events that are attributed to God in the Bible, like the resurrecting the dead, there has never been an observance of life springing into existence from things that are not living. Yet this must have happened in order for the theory of evolution to be correct. Scientists who hold to such an explanation of life are absolutely dependent for life to have sprung into existence from things that were not alive. Yet instead of believing that it is possible for life to come from something that is not alive, it is much more reasonable to conclude that life began by the actions of the living God who decided to create it. Next, as you observe the universe around you, not only should you see evidence for God in the things that we know to be true from science, but you should also see evidence for God in every place you look. Every element of this world demands that there is an intelligent creator who is behind it all, rather than being a product of chance and ultimately coming from nothing. Consider a couple of points from nature, noting that you do not have to know much about science in order to observe these points. First, design demands a designer. Take some time to look all around you and see the marvelous and complex design of the universe that is all around you. For instance, it is impossible for mankind to even be able to know how big the universe is. Just our single galaxy, the Milky Way, is estimated to be 100,000 light years in diameter, and there are an estimated 100 billion galaxies in this universe, and this likely just scratches the surface. In this unfathomably large universe, our own Earth is perfectly designed to support life, whereas no other place is known to contain everything necessary to support life. And the design of this Earth is perfect in order to accomplish that goal. Even small alterations to this Earth, like the gravitational pull, the atmosphere, the distance to the sun, the tilt on the axis, etc., would make life on this Earth impossible. Of all the life that can be observed on this Earth, there is nothing greater than the human body. Every part functions marvelously to contribute to the design and allows humans to be superior to any other form of earthly life. From the skeleton to the organs to the muscles to the cartilage to the vessels and arteries, and everything is perfectly designed. Then there are an estimated 30 trillion cells in the human body, each designed to perform a specific function, and each individual cell is incredibly complex and perfectly designed. All around us, there is tremendous design. There is design in the universe, in the earth, in the sea, in the plants, in the animals, and in mankind. And then there is a question that each person must answer in order to come to a conclusion about life and this universe. That question is, could all of this design just happen? Could it spontaneously come into being? Could it evolve over millions and billions of years? Ultimately, could it have come from nothing? We've already considered how scientific laws disprove the idea that this design could come from nothing and spontaneously happen. But what does your own reasoning conclude? For instance, suppose you were walking along the beach. You found a computer buried in the sand. How would you suppose it got there? Would you believe that something so marvelous and complex as a computer was the product of millions or billions of years of evolutionary processes? Would you believe that over this long period of time, all the right materials just happened to come together in that perfect spot to form a computer that is able to work perfectly, process information at rapid speeds, and execute complex tasks with ease? Or would you suppose that there must have been someone who designed that computer? Would you conclude that a computer is too well designed just to have come about by chance? Now, if it is unreasonable to conclude that a computer could ever spontaneously come into existence and function perfectly, why is it reasonable, according to so many people, to conclude that something as marvelous as this universe, the earth, and life on it could be the product of chance over a long period of time, ultimately originating from nothing? Surely such scientific theories are also unreasonable. Every design manifests that there was a designer. Every painting reveals there was a painter. Every poem reveals that there was a poet. Every building reveals there was an architect. Every automobile reveals that there was an engineer. Every baby reveals that there were parents. Surely everything in this universe reveals that there is a designer who is behind it all. Go back and read Psalm 19, verse 1 and Romans 1, verses 19 and 20. And then as you focus on all the design that exists in this universe, consider how intelligence came into being. Just think about all the intelligence of the life forms on this earth. How did they come into being? Do you suppose that something that is intelligent can come from something that possesses no intelligence? For instance, animals have enough intelligence that they can know how to find food, find shelter, etc. Some of them have enough intelligence to be able to obey commands like sit, stay, and roll over. They're able to make decisions for themselves. They're able to recognize their offspring. For instance, an emperor penguin can leave its young to get food, return to find its colony of penguins, and distinguish its own baby from thousands of others. Yet non-living things do not possess intelligence. Water does not possess intellect. Air does not possess intellect. How then can such intellect, how can these intelligent living beings possibly be traced back to something that is not living and possesses zero intelligence? Surely if we recognize such a principle, it ought to become even more apparent whenever you think about the marvelous design of the human brain. The human brain is considered to be the most complex thing in all of this universe. With it, people are able to make plans, to perform functions that are necessary for life, to build magnificent structures, write poetry, research the complexity of other areas of life, learn new things, communicate with other people, etc. To accomplish these things, we have each approximately 100 billion neurons or nerve cells in our brains. Interestingly, each one of these neurons connect with other neurons. In fact, one neuron can have tens of thousands of connections with other neurons. This makes it possible for bits of information to be sent all throughout your brain, functioning far better and more rapidly than the best computer. Now, again, do you suppose that all of this capacity for intelligence just happened? Do you suppose that all of this intelligence can be traced to a point at which there was no intelligence? Suppose you wanted to gain intelligence on the subject of physics. How would you go about gaining that kind of knowledge? You might go to a school that offers classes in physics so that you can learn from a professor who has gained knowledge on that subject himself. Or perhaps you would find a book that had been written on the subject by someone who is knowledgeable and study what that individual has written to help you learn. Or perhaps you have someone in your family who has knowledge of physics to learn from him or her. Or you might go about your own experimentation with things that you can observe and grow in your intelligence on the subject. Of course, there might be many ways that you could learn and gain intelligence on the subject of physics. But there is one thing you certainly would not do in order to gain intelligence in this area. You would not go to someone who has no intelligence on the subject or to an area that would offer you no intelligence about the matter. You would only pursue areas in which you could gain intellect, because intellect does not come from nothing. You would never expect just to wake up one morning and have intellect about physics, even if you lived millions and millions of years. There is not one area of our lives in which we expect for intelligence to result from nothing. We would never stand over a gallon of water and watch for the 1 gallon of water to evolve into something else or spontaneously gain intelligence, even if we had millions or billions of years to watch it. We would surely recognize that no matter what we added to that water, it would never come to life or become intelligent. The only reasonable conclusion is that there is an intelligent creator who is behind everything that possesses intellect, and his intelligence must be greater than the greatest intelligence in this world. Remember, the law that the cause must be greater than the effect. In fact, the Bible teaches that this is true about God, that his wisdom and knowledge far surpasses man's. 1 Corinthians 1 verse 25 and Romans 11 verses 33 through 36. He is the only one who could have been responsible for such great intelligence. Next, as we think about, is there really a God, we want to think about the evidence for God in the Bible. Evidence for the reality of God is certainly all around us, but now I want us to consider the evidence for the existence of God that exists in the book that claims to be from God, the Bible. As I prepare to share these thoughts with you, I recognize that we cannot prove God to be absolutely true just because there's a book that claims God to be true. There have been many books written throughout man's history that have claimed many things that are not true. But I want you to examine the evidence and see that the Bible proves itself to be from the true and living God. Consider a few pieces of evidence with me. First, the Bible is no ordinary book. Everything that we know about the Bible demonstrates that it is no ordinary book. It truly has stood the test of time and stands out far above the rest. For instance, it took about 40 men to write the words that are contained within the pages of the Bible. These words were written over a period of approximately 1,600 years on multiple continents and in 3 different languages. Yet there is a perfect degree of truth that is contained within its pages. If the Bible had been a product of only men, without any kind of divine inspiration, there would be numerous contradictions and flaws in the Bible. However, the Bible tells a single, unified story of salvation from beginning to end. It contains no contradictions, though there are contradictions that are often alleged, and everything it talks about contains perfect truth. And then consider how this book has been greatly preserved. Although there have been more attempts to silence this one book than there have been to silence any other, it has survived and even thrived. Today, most people you know probably own more than one Bible. The harmony in all of the manuscripts that contain the original texts of the Bible is incredible, and they have been incredibly preserved over thousands of years. In fact, no other book can even begin to compare with the extraordinary background of the Bible. Everything we know about it demonstrates that it is no ordinary book, even its own history. And then the Bible makes extraordinary claims. The Bible is not a book about science, medicine, geography, or any such thing. But every time it touches upon one of those subjects, it does so with perfect accuracy. In fact, the Bible makes claims that mankind did not discover until much later. How then can you possibly explain the claims of the Bible except that God was behind the words that were written in it? Consider just a couple examples. First, in Job 26 and verse 7, Job declares that God stretches out the north over empty space. He hangs the earth on nothing. But how could Job possibly know this to be true? In fact, mankind only discovered this to be absolutely true in 1475 AD. Others had speculated that the earth could be held up on the backs of elephants, by a god named Atlas, by a giant tree, etc. Now we know that the statement made by Job is absolutely true, but how could he, writing thousands of years ago, have stated this as absolute truth if mankind did not know it to be true unless God had revealed it to him? Second, in Leviticus 17 and verse 11, God declared, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood." Yet as recently as the 1700s, man believed that it was a good idea and it was common medical practice to bleed people who were sick. They believed that the toxins were in the blood and bloodletting or bleeding people would make them well. In fact, it is commonly believed that George Washington was bled to death by those who were trying to make him well. Yet the Bible taught the now recognizable truth that life is in the blood many years earlier. This is just a small sample of facts that are stated by the Bible that were not discovered by man until much later. Surely there was someone much greater who was behind their revelation. Perhaps, though, you think that these are just coincidences or educated guesses. Yet there are many of these kinds of examples that could be given in the Bible. And the Bible is 100% accurate on every point. And then, the Bible contains perfect prophecy. One thing that mankind cannot do is predict the future with complete certainty. Although it is not uncommon for individuals to make predictions that do ultimately come true, it is impossible for mankind alone to make such predictive statements that always come true hundreds, if not thousands of times with 100% accuracy. Yet the Bible does exactly that. Although there are many examples of prophecy in the Bible, we'll just consider the prophecies about Jesus here. Bible scholars have estimated that there are over 300 prophecies that were made and fulfilled about Jesus. And then consider that these prophecies were made hundreds of years before they were fulfilled. These prophecies include that Jesus was to be born of a virgin, Isaiah 7 verse 14, and Matthew 1 verses 18 and 22. That Jesus was to be born in the city of Bethlehem, as you see Micah 5 verse 2 and Matthew 2 verse 1. That Jesus would be crucified, Isaiah 53 verse 12 and Matthew 27 verse 38. That Jesus' side would be pierced, Zechariah 12 verse 10 and John 19 verse 34. And even that Jesus would descend from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and David, as you see in Matthew chapter 1. Again, we could consider hundreds of prophecies about many different subjects that are contained in the Bible, and they all have been 100% accurate. How then could man perfectly predict all of these events without ever being wrong? The simple answer is that he cannot, and that he did not. Instead, God is the only one who could possibly accomplish this. For instance, Isaiah 46 and verses 9 and 10 says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." The evidence is overwhelming. There really is a God. This lesson has only been able to cover some of the basics with regard to the evidence. Actually, everything around us serves as evidence for the existence of God. Psalm 19, verse 1. Although God gives you the ability to reject all of this evidence and choose not to believe in Him, as you see in Romans 1, verses 19 through 25, the truth of God's reality will never change. So please consider how you should respond to the reality of God. First, you must believe in Him. I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson that being able to answer the question about whether there really is a God is the most essential of all questions. The answer to this question will change your entire worldview. For those who choose not to accept all the evidence He has given for Himself will not believe what He says in His book, in the Bible. And if you do not accept what God has said in His book, your soul is in great danger. Hebrews 11 verse 6 says that God has said that without faith it's impossible to please Him. God reveals that such a person will die in his or her sins and be eternally punished with everlasting punishment in hellfire. 2 Thessalonians 1 verses 8 and 9 and Revelation 21 verse 8. Today, rather than rejecting all the evidence that exists for God, you should choose to put your full faith in Him, recognizing that He really does exist. Second, you should learn about Him. When you recognize that God really does exist, you'll want to learn about who God really is. Learning about His nature and His characteristics will only help you to honor Him in your life and listen to what He has said. For instance, there are many people who believe in an intelligent Creator, but they do not really believe in the God of the Bible. Perhaps they've rejected what God has revealed about Himself, and therefore they worship and serve a false God who they call God. Instead, you should choose to learn everything that you can know about God. In your search for this knowledge, there are only two ways God has revealed Himself to you. First, you can learn about God through His creation. Romans 1 verses 19 and 20 made it clear that we can know that God is God and that He possesses limitless power by observing what He has created. And second, you can learn about God through His Word, through the Bible. The Bible is full of information to teach us about God. For instance, the one true and living God is manifested in the three persons of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. This God is eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing, ever-present, perfectly separated from everything that is evil, loving, gracious, merciful, patient, unchanging, and severe. All of these attributes of God are identified in the pages of the Bible. And then, as you are convinced of God's reality and His true nature, you should have the desire to seek Him diligently with your life. Hebrews 11 verse 6 says, "But without faith it is impossible to please Him," that is God. "For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him." Fortunately, God has promised us that we can find Him if we will seek Him with this kind of diligence. Acts 17 verse 27. To truly seek after God, you must dedicate yourself to worshiping Him according to how He desires to be worshiped. Put your whole trust in Him, fear Him, and obey Him. For instance, Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14 says that this is your entire duty while you live on this earth. It says, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, and keep His commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. If you fail to see God in your life, you will waste your life." Is there really a God? Yes, there really is a God. He is the only reasonable answer to the origins of the universe, the earth, life, intelligence, and every other thing. Yet, will you choose to believe in Him completely? And will you choose to seek Him with your whole life?